Hello and welcome back to our studies on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. This is study number 21, and each study lasts 30 minutes. And we're going on in a study of the book I wrote on Soren Kierkegaard called Soren Kierkegaard, Night of Infinite Resignation. And this is a book I published in 2009. And we're continuing through the book until we get done. And when we're done, we'll probably have about 40 studies altogether, I think. It's not that easy to really summarize SK. So in the study we did at St. Paul's Lutheran Church last year, some of the students said that there needs to be a deeper explanation. So the whole reason for these studies is to get further into the philosophical and aesthetic works of Soren Kierkegaard. Soren Kierkegaard was a 19th century philosopher who lived in Copenhagen, Denmark. He lived between the years of 1813 and 1855. So in this study, we're going to do a summary of the aesthetic sphere. All 20 studies so far involved really just the introduction and the analysis of the aesthetic sphere. And now I think it's time to do a review and also why these studies are so important for Christianity and for the understanding of philosophy. And this was an issue that Pastor Schmidt at St. Paul's brought up as to what really is the importance of SK's writings. And in this study, which is a joy and a privilege for me to bring to the world, it will be recorded on YouTube for the rest of the world to see, and also for future generations to see. And there are few intellectual studies that are so fascinating as the study of SK. Now, to begin this study, I just thought we should do a brief review of the last chapter, which was the chapter 7. And I'm just going to give you actually the conclusion of chapter 7. In the realm of the poetic and the intellectual, existence becomes an imaginary sort of existence. The realm of the intellect, the realm, for example, in Hegel of pure thought, or the I am I, a mathematical sort of point outside of reality. And we're going to get into that a lot further when we get into concept of dread a lot later in this book. The speculative thinking, and to get a whole view of what we've been studying, you're going to have to go back to prior studies, and the last 2 or 3 or 4 studies that lead up to this. But I always think it's good to do a little bit of repetition, because that's the way we learn, especially you learn someone as complicated as SK. In the speculative abstraction of someone like a Hegel or Karl Marx, and eventually other speculative philosophers, existence in a sense is over, and all of the existence can be placed into a system. It is done. It is over with. The speculative thinker, in his abstraction of mind, has turned existence into a system. There is no longer an either-or, because everything has been figured out. Such a system does actually exist for God in his foreknowledge, but not for an existing individual. For the subjective thinker, poetics and intellect thinking are just one part of existing in the real world. Thought is not the ultimate phase of existing. To put thought above everything is a pure distraction of mind. In the speculative thinking, as Johannes Climacus says, everything has been finished, and speculative thought now has to only rubricate, that means highlight, classify, and methodically arrange the various concepts. One does not live anymore in this understanding that was so prevalent in the 19th century. One does not act, one does not believe, but one knows what love and faith are, and it only remains to determine their place in the system. But to give you the kind of the conclusion of SK in expressing his understanding in his belief in existential thinking, existential philosophy, SK gives this analysis. Existence involves a tremendous contradiction from which the subjective thinker does not have to abstract, although he can if he will, but in which it is his business to remain. For the dialectic of the world history, the individual vanishes in humanity. You and I, any particular existing individual, cannot become visible to such a dialectic. All existential problems are really passionate problems. For when existence is interpenetrated with reflection, it generates passion. To think about existential problems in such a way as to leave out the passion is tantamount to not thinking about them at all, since it is to forget the point, which is that the thinker is himself an existing individual. The subjective thinker is not a man of science, but an artist. Existing is an art. The subjective thinker is aesthetic enough to give his life aesthetic content, ethical enough to regulate it, and dialectical enough to interpenetrate it with thought. So this is the conclusion of the aesthetic and philosophical sphere. And we're going to get into the ethical sphere in the next lesson. But it's a good time to take a break and kind of review what really is the significance for modern thinking, especially for Christians, in the understanding of the relationship between reason and faith. And this is what my next book is going to be about. It will be a continuation of existential thinking as SK originally understood it. And what does this mean epistemologically for Christianity? And this is a major point that Pastor Schmidt brought up in one of our studies at St. Paul's. What it really is the significance of what we're studying here so far. Well, my next book will be on the history of existentialism since Kierkegaard. And two authors I like to bring up in this study, which will be the topic of my next book, are Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Jaspers, two 20th century philosophers who adopted SK's thinking and called it existentialism. And I'm going to go into the fallacy of what they're thinking in terms of SK's epistemology. And it's really a vital study for Christians as to how to explain Christianity in terms that a philosopher can understand. Now, there are two reinterpretations of Christianity in this book. Bultmann tried to interpret Christianity in terms of social and historical phenomenon. Karl Jaspers tried to reinterpret Christianity in terms of what he called cipher language. So both of these are both an attempt to interpret Kierkegaard's existentialism without the Christian presupposition. And both are false and flawed for a couple of major reasons, which SK already pointed out. as we've really discussed before, Christianity represents an absolute paradox. That is, that the eternal became temporal, grew up, and died. It is impossible to mediate or try, that is, to understand an absolute paradox. And we've talked about that already in SK's analysis of the self-irony of reason and the absolute paradox. Secondly, Christianity, another junk call, keep getting those from Bresnan. Christianity asserts itself as the absolute truth. Since truth is the measure of itself and a falsehood, it can only be understood by understanding the concept more and more deeply. And this is a concept we've repeated over and over again, and we'll probably repeat for a number of other times before we're done with the book, because it is essential. And that is the ultimate truth cannot be understood in any other way but by absorbing that or studying that truth in itself. If there's a higher truth, then this one particular truth is not absolute truth. So if Hegel's understanding of Christianity is right, then he is really, his interpretation of Christianity is the ultimate truth and not Christianity. But for the Christian thinker, Christianity is the absolute truth. Now, you can accept that or you can reject it however you want. But since it establishes itself, it proclaims itself as the absolute truth, then it is. And if you want to say, okay, well, I have a better idea, I have a higher understanding of Christianity than Christianity itself, well, then your interpretation is the truth. But that's not what Christianity teaches. Christianity teaches that Christianity itself is the absolute truth, and the appropriation of Christianity is a study of truth as the measure of itself and a falsehood which never ends. The Bible is constantly something as the ultimate truth that one continually tries to understand. If the philosopher wants to meddle in Christianity, he should just get away from it. Create his own system. If he wants to recreate Christianity, don't call it Christianity because it's not. Not according to the biblical definition of what Christianity is. So there are these two reasons. Christianity asserts itself as the absolute paradox which cannot be understood. And then it also, in the Bible, it proclaims itself as ultimate truth. And since ultimate truth is the measure of itself and a falsehood, there is no higher understanding. The philosopher should just leave it alone. If he doesn't want to accept it, okay, then don't accept it. But don't interpret Christianity like Bultmann or Jaspers does. Bultmann in terms of historical and sociological truths, and then Karl Jaspers in terms of cipher language. And I've never really understood what he meant by cipher language. He says it's just something that keeps developing. Well, that's a pretty pathetic understanding. And really, actually, Bultmann points out that it's just another issue of hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is just a fancy word for how we interpret and translate ancient scripts or fundamental scriptural truths, especially. Hermeneutics is how we translate, how we interpret. And his way is not biblical. There's nothing in his way, which is extremely vague, that can be found in Scripture. So he's introducing something that isn't even scriptural. And Bultmann does much the same thing in his understanding and trying to interpret Christianity in terms of the social and historical phenomenon or development. Both are pathetic losers in their understanding and their attempt at understanding Christianity. So those are the two major points of thinking that SK brings. And the two major points that I will discuss in further depth in my next book on existentialism. And I'm going to start off much the same way that SK does, not with an inductive approach, but with a deductive approach. I start off with two observations. First of all, deductively, I'm going to posit a project of thinking, a project which no one has to accept if they don't want. I can't force anybody to accept anything, just like SK never did, and that's why Jaspers is totally wrong in saying that SK represents forced Christianity. Nothing could be further from the truth. He represents it as a possibility, which you can accept, or maybe you don't want to accept it. That is up to you. And what I'm going to do is do a deductive approach as a possibility rather than an inductive approach. And all logic goes one or the other way. You start with an inductive, like a Descartes. De omnibus dubitata demest, doubt everything. Well, if you doubt everything, then you got to build. And you really can't start if you're doubting everything. But my approach is to assume things and then work down deductively. And in my next book, I'm going to start off with this analysis. And I'll start off with two simple things. What do I know to be certain? And what is truth? Because both are very good questions. Because if I can start off with this, I know where I am and I know where I want to go. All good philosophy should start out with these two questions, to answer ultimate truths. Because that is the only way you know where to start and where you want to go. So I'll provide two possible answers. I am certain of my own being. I am certain that I exist. As SK would say, I am, therefore I am. So if I am, why wonder that I am? Because that's self-evident. Everybody knows they are. You can't doubt that because you know you exist. Then secondly, truth is the highest reality I can know. So then I'm certain of my own being because I know that. That's perfectly obvious. It doesn't take a philosopher to tell you exist. You know you exist because you exist. And then truth is the highest reality one can know. And you can give the name God to it. That's perfectly fine. And that's what I do in the book as a possible thought experiment. The truth is really knowing the God, because the God is the absolute, the ultimate truth of all of existence. So those are the two premises that I start off with. In my next book. And then I point out once again about these two things that Christianity asserts. Philosophers have wasted countless hours meddling with Christianity and trying to interpret it in terms of higher criticism. This is all a pointless waste of time for philosophy, because Christianity asserts the absolute paradox, and Christianity asserts the absolute truth. So either it's absolutely true or it's absolutely not true. And so from these initial observations, I get into this whole continuation of SK's original thinking about existential thinking and where philosophy in modern times has gone wrong. So then I'm going to pick up in this book on the supposition the once again, a possible thought experiment that Christianity really is the knowledge of God, just like SK proclaims, and the Bible proclaims, is that this is, that whether it's true or not, that's a totally different question. And each person has to answer that question for himself. But what the philosopher, what the theologian could do, is bring the person just as close as they can to that leap of faith, to believe or not to believe. And this is why this study is especially so important for intellectual people, philosophers, who are interested in Christianity. So that's the way I'm going to continue my book, as a thought experiment in the same spirit as SK. The thought that there is a higher criticism, a higher idea of Christianity than Christianity itself is as old as the temptation of Eve in the Garden of Eden. Eve was tempted by Satan, as everybody knows, to believe something outside the Word of God. God said, do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you shall surely die. And Eve was tempted by Satan and changed just one word, and just put in this one word, you may die if you do this. And Satan convinced Eve that there was a higher learning, a higher sort of understanding than what is in God's Word, which is the Bible. So it goes back to the temptation of Eve in the Garden of Eden. And hopefully through the next work I write, I'll put Christianity back on top, where, you know, the thinkers like, there have been many thinkers like Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Jaspers, D.F. Strauss, Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, who, you know, tried to put philosophy on top of Christianity. Well, Kierkegaard did just the exact opposite, and put Christianity on top of philosophy. And this is a battle that it has gone on and will go on probably till doomsday, about the superior understanding of truth in philosophy versus Christianity. So that's a preview and kind of an overall summary of what we've gone on, what we've studied so far. So that's the first thing I just wanted to discuss here. And we have 7 more minutes. So, what I like to do is I'd like to give a preview of where we're going. So we just got done with the aesthetic sphere of existence. It took us 20 studies. This is study number 21. Each are 30 minutes long. And next we're going to get into the ethical sphere. The ethical sphere is a transitional phase between the aesthetic and philosophical, and then the ethical, or the religious, the religious sphere, which we will get into in Religiousness A and Religiousness B. But it is a turning about in a person's life. And we've discussed all of this in SK's own life, on how he was leading a life to perdition. And then at one point he came to his senses and decided he wanted to relinquish that life, give up a life of perdition, and reform. And his reform would later bring him into Religiousness A and Religiousness B, which is the Christian religion. And there's a tremendous amount of knowledge and thinking here in this conversion from the ethical to the religious. And we're going to go through all of it in this book, in this chapter in this book. It's chapter 8. A tremendous amount of things to understand. And for SK in the ethical sphere, the most important aspect of the ethical sphere is marriage, love and marriage, and how love needs to be understood in the ethical institution of marriage. And it's a tremendous, tremendous study. And, I wish I could get into the whole thing, but, it would take hours and hours and hours. But we'll get into a lot more of it as we go along. And there are two books here that we will look at. One is Either Or, Volume 1, or Volume 2, rather, I'm sorry, Volume 2, and Stages on Life's Way in the ethical analysis of marriage and love. We've already covered the idea of romantic love, but now in the ethical sphere, we're going to cover the Christian or the ethical understanding of love as constituted in Christian marriage, and how the only way to really have a happy marriage is God's blessing. And what do we have? We have about 4 minutes and 15 seconds. So let me just give a little bit of overview of this. So we'll go on here through that part of it. And actually, as SK says, the ethical sphere is a transitional phase to the the truly religious sphere. And in the truly religious sphere, what we're going to be looking at is a few books. And the first book is going to be on concept of dread. No, I'm sorry. Fear and trembling. Fear and trembling really marks the conversion from the ethical or religiousness A to the specifically religion, specifically Christian religion, and how he comes to this through Quidam's diary and his own personal crisis that he had with the breakup of his engagement to Regina. So we'll go through Quidam's diary, which is unbelievably complex. It comprises hundreds and hundreds of pages, and Walter Lowry, SK's greatest translator, said he wished SK had never written. I disagree with Walter Lowry on that, because I think it's incredibly fascinating. So it is really the teleological suspension of the ethical that we analyze in chapter 10, which marks the conversion from the ethical to Christianity in specifically. Then we've got a long way to go, because we're only starting on a great genius thinker. We're just touching the surface. We will have to go through concept of dread. Now, concept of dread is really in chapter 11. See, repetition and no. We're going to go through repetition, and then we'll go on to concept of dread. And concept of dread is one of my favorite books of SK's writings. To me, I put it in. And this we get into finally in chapter 12. Concept of dread is an extraordinarily fascinating study. And then we'll go into his psychological works, namely Sickness Unto Death, Concept of Dread, and then Sickness Unto Death. And then finally, his analysis of Christianity is a question of pathos and a question of dialectics. And then, finally, his attack upon Christendom, which is the most difficult of all of his works. It really is. Not because it's intellectually difficult, because it is so extremely controversial. And I have some thoughts, not to take anything out of SK's words, because he wrote that without a pseudonym. He wrote it in his own voice, and so it requires a high deal of respect for SK, but at the same time, I think it bears a commentary, and that's hopefully what I will do. And it's going to take us numerous studies to get through it all, but I really appreciate everybody coming, and hopefully we'll get into the ethical sphere sometime tomorrow. Thanks for attending, and goodbye.